Savior, JT.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Peacemakers. I am Dr. Michael Patterson, and I am here today with my buddy and friend, my brother, Nick Stone Street, and we have another exciting episode for you today. Nick, how you doing, man?
I'm good. I'm fired up about this episode and our time here with our guest today.
Yeah, why don't you tell everyone who we have with us today?
All right. You know, that we were playing a game where best beard wins, Marty would win. So we've got Marty Solomon with us, who is president of Impact Campus Ministries and is the co-host of the BEMA podcast, BEMA podcast. And it's been a remarkable podcast and really it's given me so much to think about. And we're just grateful that Marty's here to spend some time with us. So Marty, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for letting me be here. It'll be fun.
Well, Marty had a big influence on our firm already here at Ronald Blue Trust because of the theme of our Legacy Summit last year was Peacemakers Partnering with God to Heal Financial Brokenness. And a lot of the thoughts around partnering with God came from a lot of the things that Marty talks about. And with Peacemakers, we talk a lot about racial reconciliation and how we live together. And so perfect time to talk through some real issues.
Real issues, and I want to say thank you. I've been listening to the BEMA podcast. I spent 2020 listening. I was sheltered in, and Nick had said, check it out. And, I'm like, okay, I'll get to it. And I got hooked. And I greatly appreciate the way you explain the Jewish culture, the Jewish tradition, and the rich history of God's people and how we are included in that. So thank you so much for that amazing explanation. Today, I was hoping you could explain and help us better understand the whole concept of being the church. Because, for so many of us as Americans, we have grown up thinking about our personal relationship with God, our individual relationship with God, and we struggle with that whole concept of community. And I know in the book of Acts, that's what the apostles were trying to help our early brothers and sisters to understand the importance of community.
Yeah, and I think the dominant piece of that we so often miss was this, I often will call it radical fellowship with people we don't agree with. That was the dominant characteristic of the early church that made it such a powerful thing. In today's world, particularly our Western American context, we've connected faith and church to consumerism so much that when you talk about community, a lot of us think about friendships, which are great. And so many of us struggle with loneliness. And obviously, I don't want to take anything away from friendships and good relationships. But the thing that marked the early church and the thing that Jesus prayed about in the garden right before he dies, that is unity. Unity is not uniformity. Those are two separate things. In fact, unity requires diversity. And so what Jesus did with his disciples for 3 years was take a bunch of guys who saw the world radically differently and invited them to see the world through a new lens in him, which they didn't seem to get. Even that very night that Jesus goes to the cross, the very night he prays that prayer, they sat at dinner arguing about who is the greatest. But something happens with this Pentecost movement post-resurrection, this Spirit of God that indwells his people. And they do get it. And they start to, these different people groups, interact together and build a whole new way of seeing the world. Not just in the way that they explain it, not just in the words that they use, but in the lives that they live out. And because of that radical fellowship, that's what, according to Jesus, he says, that's how the world will know that you sent me. That they would be one. And the they is that not a similar tribal identity. That they is a radically diverse group of people. And because they come together, the world will see God. The world will see Jesus. And I think that's a defining characteristic of that group of people.
Wow, that's a great explanation. Thank you for that. So in Acts 2:42 it says they devoted themselves to apostle teachings, and we can all agree we need to read the Bible and try to live it out, fellowship. I hear what you're saying, but most times I like to fellowship with people I like.
Right?
People who are
Absolutely.
easy to get along with. And you just described that ragtag group of disciples. They
Yep.
weren't, those initial guys who followed Jesus didn't all have the same worldview or ideology.
Right.
Because I know a few minutes ago you explained who they were. Could you just go briefly break down who the 12 were?
Yeah, you had all of these different worldviews colliding at this point in history. You had, because of Rome, what do you do with this Greco-Roman worldview that really, depending on who you are, stands against your Jewish identity in a lot of ways? What do you do with Rome? And so some people thought there was no problem with Rome. Like one Jewish perspective was that of the Herodian perspective. And they would have said that Rome's fine. Like I can worship God, I can go to synagogue on Shabbat, and I can still have art and running water. And I think most of us can relate to this because most of us in our culture would say, I can have my technology, I can have my consumerism as long as it's not an idolatry.
Right.
I can have both. I can have God too, Jesus too. There were some in leadership. The Sadducees would be the representative group of this that leveraged this Roman presence for their own good. They lined their own pockets. It was a lot of religious and corruption. You have some groups that left and just ran off to the desert, groups like the Essenes. They saw the corruption, they saw the danger, and they ran off to the desert to be completely devoted. And they did unbelievable things. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls because of communities like this. They had unbelievable devotion, and yet because they were out in the middle of the desert, their missional impact, we might say, was marginal as far as impacting that culture. And then you had other groups that were unbelievably devoted, and they left, the Hasidim, the Pharisees and the Zealots. One group that said we're going to use the sword, one group that says we're not going to use the sword. Both of these groups unbelievably devoted to walking out God's way, and as long as we walk out God's way, God will rescue us. And what Jesus does when he calls his disciples is he seems to choose multiple members from these groups. So the first 5 he calls Peter, Andrew, James, John, and Philip. Those are from Bethsaida. That would be a Pharisaical fishing village. So those are Pharisees. The next person he calls is Matthew, a tax collector, who would have literally been a guy they hated. Like he was an absolute traitor that had sold himself out to the Romans. They would have hated what this guy was and what he stood for.
So Matthew would have been the guy collecting taxes from them.
Absolutely.
And now,
Absolutely.
and now he's in the circle.
Absolutely. And he just got called to be. So they would have not had a fun reaction to that idea. And there's a couple other disciples that seem to have Greek names, which would lead you to think they're a little bit more Herodian, because if you're truly sold out, you're not naming your kids Greek names. But then you have other, we seem to know that Jesus has Essene connections through John the Baptist. We know that John is connected to the Sadducees. On some level, he's related, because that's how they get into the courtyard the night that Jesus is on trial. So you have Sadducee connections, you've got Pharisees, you've got Herodians, you've got Essenes. He calls 2 zealots, Simon the Zealot. These are guys that would have taken a vow to kill people like Matthew.
Assassins?
More like insurgents. Like godly, they would have viewed themselves as like, we would use words like terrorists.
Terrorists, yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Okay.
Jesus is actually crucified as the word that gets used there is not robber, like we often say robbers. The word that's used there is actually terrorist. It's a zealot. The kanaim, the zealous ones. It's a Greek word, but it's the same word used to reference that group of people. So Jesus gets crucified as a terrorist between 2 other terrorists, is how Rome would have talked about them. But yeah, these are guys that completely disagree with how to see the world. And Jesus calls them together, which is why for 3 years they can't quit arguing about who's the greatest. It's not about my greatness, it's about my worldview and my rightness.
Right.
Which if that doesn't remind us of home, I'm not sure what would. That's just Facebook in the first century.
There were even age differences, right, Marty? Because I've heard you talk before about Jesus, basically, the first 5 guys he called, he had a teen ministry.
Yeah, I think probably most of them would. I think the biblical evidence is that Peter's probably your oldest, and Peter's probably the only one over 18. Because when they're confronted about the temple tax, Jesus tells them to go catch a fish, and there's a 2 drachma coin to pay your tax and mine. Well, Jesus is responsible for all of their taxes if they owe them. Only those over 18 have to pay it. So Peter is probably the only one that, I don't know, 19, 20, 21 years old. The rest of them likely fall underneath. People often will say, but Matthew's a tax collector, he has to be older. And that's not true because Rome wanted to use youth. It's how you could keep them captive.
That makes
You
sense.
kept them in fear, and you could control them if they were younger. So Matthew's probably a younger guy too.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's so insightful. So even those guys having a meal together would
Huge.
have been a huge challenge.
Huge. Yep. Absolutely. And they would have, all being members of the Havurah, they would have seen that as, well, okay, this is what we're going to do for the next 3 years. I'm sure they never envisioned liking it. Like, I'm sure those 3 years, a lot of them couldn't wait for the day that they'd all be done and they could go do things the right way. And what ends up happening is they learn this new way in Jesus, and then empowered by the Holy Spirit, they end up doing things that I can't imagine they ever saw coming, that they would ever sit around and form a new community built on that diversity. That's a huge deal.
Wow. Okay, so we know they were devoted, teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread. Now, in our culture, meals, you stop by McDonald's, you go through Chick-fil-A, it's just not that big of a deal. But in the Eastern world, I believe meals have a different connotation.
Yeah, meals are huge statements. If you're eating a meal with somebody, it means that you are in right relationship with them. You are telling the world that me and this person that we're eating with, we're good. This even goes back to Leviticus. When you see the sacrifices, some of these sacrifices that you bring to the temple, you eat with the priest in the presence of God. Because what's being said to everybody is that God and I were good. And that priest is that representative. Things are right. So one of the things that you see everybody getting upset about is Jesus eating with tax collectors, sinners. Because what Jesus is doing when he says that is, we're good. Like, I'm in right relationship with these folks. And people are thinking, how can you be, like, they see it as condoning things that they just can't even fathom that Jesus could condone, but he's emphasizing right relationship. So meals were a huge deal for that. This is even true in today's culture. It wasn't very long ago, there was a young man that was from a Jewish family who on some rainy night took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in Palestinian territory. He ended up hitting a child there. And there was actually a Christian group that kind of whisked him away and rescued him. But they also set up what was called a solcha meal. And the solcha meal is a meal of restoration. And so the Palestinian family invited this Jewish family to have a meal. And they broke bread together. They got together, and when they went to eat, it was the father who had a hard time saying anything for obvious reasons. He had lost a son. But the grandfather, the patriarch, approached that Jewish family, broke bread, and said, "You are family with us now, and we will never speak of this again."
Wow.
And it's that's what a meal signifies. It is a kind of, not just an abstract, distant forgiveness, but an absolute and complete restoration of relationship. And so a meal is a huge deal. It's not just practical. I think in our culture, like, I would have lunch with somebody that I totally disagreed with and probably wouldn't talk real well of after we were all done, but I'd still eat with them. In that culture, if you eat with them and people see it, you're making a statement about, I'm good with this person.
Wow.
And so this whole idea of breaking bread has a lot of significance. I know we spoke earlier about kind of the Roman view and the Jewish view of bread.
Yeah, there seems to be, at least some scholars have this sense that breaking bread was a Jewish practice long before we connect it to the Eucharist in Jesus. So one of the things that Caesar would do that they often talk about in history is they called bread and circus. And Caesar, the emperor, would come through your town, come through your city, come through the countryside, and he would give out bread. And it was a show, so they called it bread and circus, because it was this show of Caesar saying, I'm the one that provides for you. I'm the one that Rome is the one. I'm the one, Caesar, emperor. I'm the one that gives you bread. I sustain you. And it seems like the Jews had this practice of getting together and breaking bread as a symbolic gesture of Caesar doesn't give us bread. Caesar's not Lord. Caesar's not where provision comes from. But God is. And community is where we find that provision, our relationships with each other. And so that's a practice that seems, in what I have learned, to predate even the Eucharistic expression that we know so well.
That's good. Thank you for sharing it. So we know the church started off primarily Jewish, well, predominantly Jewish people.
Yep.
Everybody shared heritage, shared basically ideals. But what about when we started seeing Gentiles come into the fold?
Absolutely.
Now, were they welcome to sit down at the same table?
And that was the great, I mean, that's your moment. That's what your New Testament is really all about. Like, we make the New Testament a lot of things, but the New Testament seen in context is really about this huge idea. Romans, Galatians, these letters that Paul writes, not all of them, but a lot of these major letters that we've turned into something else were really letters written to deal with this Jewish Gentile. When the Gentiles start coming in, and they've always been present, even in Judaism before Jesus, Gentiles were welcome, and they argued about it between Hillel and Shammai. In the Jewish worldview, you had these two rabbis. What do we do with the Gentiles? One group said this, one group said another, but they were always kind of welcome. But they were definitely, they're in the balcony. They're on the fringe. They're distant cousins, but they're not brothers. They're welcome cousins, but they're not brothers. And then this Jesus movement comes along.
Oh, so you're saying they could be around?
Yeah, come to synagogue.
They could come to synagogue.
Absolutely.
They had to stay in a special place, though. And
Well, in some regards. So Shammai and Hillel had an argument about that. Like, what do you do? Obviously, we want the Jews to come, and they want to worship the God of Israel. That's great. Shammai said, that's great. It just doesn't get them anything. If they want to be right with God, they're going to have to become Jewish. They need to get circumcised. They need to eat kosher. They need to do all those things. Hillel said, no. Like, we can look at Torah and see that they can be justified in God just by believing in the promises of God. They're welcome to be in synagogue, and they can even find justification in God, Hillel said, long before Jesus. This is 40 years before Jesus. They're having these conversations. What Christianity does is, because even Hillel would have said, no, they can find justification for God. Now listen, they're not one of us.
right.
They're they can be present, they can sit in synagogue, they can, but they're cousins. They're B'nai Noach. They're children of Noah. They're not children of Abraham. They're children of Noah.
So they couldn't be engrafted into the family.
Right.
Okay.
Right. They're welcome to be here. They can even be loved by God, Hillel would say. What Paul does is he argues for a much more full inclusion, where he literally calls them in Galatians B'nai Avraham, because he says what makes you a children. This is the hinge point of Paul's argument. What makes you a child of Abraham is not your circumcision and your kosher eating, but your trust in the promises of God. So if you trust in the promises of God, you're a full-fledged child of Abraham. And this is, even today, in today's world, that is a radical, radical claim. That Gentiles aren't distant cousins, but full-fledged adopted kids. And adoption in that first world is complete. There's no, much like we would want to express it in our own world, adoption is complete adoption. You are completely the same as a biological child.
Not half a part of the family.
Right, absolutely.
Okay.
And so this is the argument that's being made. And so those famous statements that many scholars will point out, Paul's statement about there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, the earliest reference, unwritten record that we have of somebody making a call for equality. Like that's the oldest reference we have in written human literature of somebody arguing for any form of equality. That's huge. That's huge. That's the people of God. That's the Jesus movement being on the literal front edge of, words are so tricky today. Inclusion. It's a dirty word for so many people. But that was the gospel. The gospel for Paul was inclusion. It was people that were outside being brought near. He'll tell the Ephesians, you who were far off. And the pronouns in Ephesians are important because he's talking about Gentiles. He'll say, we, Jews, you, Gentiles, you who were far off. Well, Jesus came and proclaimed to you peace, and then he proclaimed peace to us, and now Jesus has broken down this barrier wall, and you who were foreigners, you're no longer foreigners. You're fellow citizens and members of God's household built on the foundations of the apostles and the prophets. That's a radical message of full inclusion.
And some people aren't that familiar with ancient history. So could we say, looking at parts of India where they still have the caste system, could that represent some of what the ancient world was like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Rome and Rome was very economic. The
Okay.
Roman caste system was literally about numerics, like the numerical amount of sesterces you had in the bank determined your class. So there were freeborn. There's everything from freeborn to decurion to epicurean to senator. Each one of those things determined by how much money you literally had in your bank account. Below that line is slave class. Now, you either were a freedman, which meant you were a slave but are no longer, or you're a slave. Some scholars will say a third of Rome was slave class. All of these things, it was very socioeconomic, those distinctions. And so what you see in the New Testament is all those social distinctions are every distinction, every category that Rome depended upon to determine where you were and where you fit in a world of patronage, is what the system was called. You always had to have somebody above you that was helping you. You had to have a patron, somebody that was helping you succeed. It was all built on this ladder. And what you have in the New Testament community is people completely ignoring that ladder. There is no ladder in this New Testament community. There is no Epicurean and Decurion. It's all one table. It's all one broken bread and juice shared together. That's why there is no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Paul attacks religious identity, Jew or Greek. He attacks economic identity, slave or free. He attacks gender identity, male or female. It doesn't take away those identities, right? It doesn't take away male or female. You're obviously still male. You're obviously still female. But none of those things define your place in the family. All those defining characteristics are gone at the table.
So when we get to 1 Corinthians 11, and Paul is helping Corinth understand the communion.
And Corinth has a problem with this.
Okay.
How do you mean?
Corinth, so the whole letter of Corinthians starts, 1 Corinthians. Apparently they've written Paul, because Paul says, he talks about, as you wrote me, that you wrote me about these questions. And
Right.
Paul says, I'm going to respond to these questions. So they've written Paul, and Paul is writing in response. And from chapter 1, the thing that Paul is dealing with is division. He's immediately in chapter 1 dealing with divisions in the church. And he talked about the wisdom of Christ in the second chapter. And then the third chapter, Paul goes into this. So who is Apollos? Apparently there were groups of people that were like, well, I'm a disciple of Apollos. Another group, well, I'm a disciple of Paul. And then the really spiritual group was like, well, I'm a disciple of Jesus. But everybody was about which group do I
Right.
belong to? And Paul says, you can't. And so Paul is like going through all of these responses of this very divided body. He gets to this, and he goes into like 1 Corinthians 8 and 9. He's all talking about how you're supposed to consider others in the way that you eat, in the way that you conduct yourselves, in the things that you attend or don't attend, the things you abstain from, the things you indulge. All of that should be done by considering the other. And then it's all like seems to culminate. It kind of finds a crescendo in obviously 1 Corinthians 13 in the chapter on love. But 1 Corinthians 11, right before that, Paul says, and you gather for this breaking of bread, which we talked about earlier. And the problem is one group is getting drunk. Which drunkenness isn't the point. It's the excess that's the point. One of you has so much you're getting drunk. Another group is going hungry. And then you break bread in the midst of this. And Paul at some point says you need to discern the body, because if you don't discern the body when you engage in the Eucharist, you eat and drink judgment on yourself. And we often think in the Christian tradition that what Paul is doing is saying, hold the bread, think about the bread, and think about your own individual sinfulness. Discern the body. But the only body that Paul has been talking about for the entire letter of Corinthians is the body of Christ. Don't you know that you are all members of one body? The body Paul's referencing is the body of Christ. And he just got after them for having some that are rich and some that are poor, he's asking them to discern their relationships. Discern whether or not you have a truly, this flat table we were just talking about. Because apparently there is slave and free in Corinth. Apparently there is Jew and Greek. There is male and female. And those things make a difference. And Paul is saying, if you don't discern that, how dare you take the Eucharist? Because the Eucharist should be a testimony to the world that there's a new way of ordering ourselves, and it's a flat table, and there are no distinctions that give anybody any sense of hierarchy. To use that famous phrase, it's all level at the foot of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you're not bearing testimony to that, you eat and drink judgment on yourself.
So for us today as Americans striving to be disciples of Christ,
we probably have some work to do.
we got some work to do.
Still a lot of disunity out there.
I would imagine
I don't know if you've
so.
noticed that.
I would imagine there's a lot of people taking communion, thinking about their own sinfulness and their own relationship with God,
Mm-hmm.
discerning the body and not discerning the body.
Okay.
Like a lot of people reflecting on my own sin, the forgiveness that I need, me and Jesus, me and Jesus, me and Jesus. And I would imagine if we were to look up in our churches and first of all, just start with the relationships there.
Mm-hmm.
Does our church truly, is that what heaven looks like? Do my relationships, do I have people I won't eat with, people I won't talk to, people I won't, and that doesn't mean we all have to be best friends.
Right.
But does grace reign here, or are there divisions? Because if there's divisions, we should probably fix those as we take the broken body, the body and blood of Jesus. Let alone the fact if we got even deeper into that and reflected on, is this room reflect what I'm told about? Every time we get a vision of heaven in the Bible, the first thing that everybody has to tell us is that everybody is there. Every tongue, every tribe, every nation. Old Testament or New Testament, no matter who gets the vision of heaven, the first thing they have to tell us is, guys, you don't understand. Everybody was there.
Everybody's welcome.
Do our churches look like that?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it a bunch of people that look like me? Like most of the churches I've ever been involved with and grown up in have been very, very white churches. They didn't look like a heaven where there was every tribe, every people, every tongue. And so how do we discern the body? Is there any discerning that needs to go on there? Is that the product of something? Is that an appropriate uniformity? Or is there something that we probably ought to examine about whether or not we truly represent the gospel in the way that we conduct ourselves and order ourselves? Because I know in the bodies I'm a part of, that's the result of a world that we have created for ourselves, not a world that we've created for.
Yeah, I can understand, and I appreciate you saying that because it's so easy to conform to the world, to society, and try to build church around society versus saying, no, we're really going to make a difference, and we're going to try to be different than society.
Right.
That takes a lot of work, Marty.
Yep.
Yeah,
It takes a lot of work.
In the U.S., we get those divisions a lot by race.
Mm-hmm.
And when we lived in Brazil, Rhonda and I remember this famous quote from the great soccer player Pelé, who said, the more money I made, the whiter I became. And so
And he was a dark-skinned brother.
Yeah, he's a dark-skinned brother for sure. And it's this idea that even when we lived in a society where people didn't judge each other based on color, because it doesn't have that feel in Brazil like it has here, there's still another way they would judge, and it was by socioeconomics. So it just seems like as people, we're always finding ways to categorize and divide, and yet, the gospel is calling us to be in one body. How do you bring that back together?
Right. Like we have to listen for those voices that are, you have to listen for, we have to be curious and empathetic. Like we have to honestly be curious. We have to listen to those voices that are different from us. We have to listen to those voices that we have purposely put in places that we conveniently get to ignore. We have to watch for the people that have been pushed to the outside. When people speak up and cry out in the name of injustice, we need to listen. We need to be curious and ask ourselves. That's not because of politics or because of the gospel. Like the gospel demands that we would listen to those voices and be curious and then be empathetic, to seek to understand, because that's where all of a sudden those outsiders, those mumsers, that's where you find out who's missing from the table. Like I would assume those people in Corinth that were getting drunk probably needed to just do more listening to the people who were hungry in their fellowship, to be more curious, more empathetic, and that's where the gospel gets a chance. But we don't like that, so we like to try to ostracize, marginalize those voices, get those voices to quiet down, create worlds where I'm insulated from those voices, and then I just don't have to deal with it. I don't have to be curious. And I don't have to be empathetic because we all agree.
Or if you can categorize people and invalidate them,
Yeah,
then you don't
absolutely.
have to listen to
if I
them.
can demonize this, if I can redefine terms so that I automatically can write it out without even having to be curious about it, absolutely. We're really good at this. Like, we're really, really good at this.
Well, it's interesting to live in a society that defines people by their worst moments, right? So if somebody had a microphone on me all day, and then we put it in the Wall Street Journal, like, I'd be fired. They'd pick up at least 3 comments a day of things, and we just look like what's somebody's worst moment, and then that's who they are.
Yeah.
And yet the scriptures are so different in bringing community together. You can't define people by their worst moments. But look at, Peter seems to have made a good recovery.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Peter did make it. And Peter had his moments, man.
Oh,
Peter went
yes,
through
he
his
did.
ups and downs of learning this very truth that we're talking about. And he did. He also got stuck a few times, apparently. Paul has to confront Peter. Peter does get stuck, but he also learns and apparently makes it, because at key moments in this whole movement of the church, Peter is there to say, this is the right thing to do. Peter, as the leader, leads the community of the gospel forward.
So this is it's kind of a strange relationship, I think, when you think about Peter and Paul, just as far as those two being in community. But I think, I don't know I think it was you, Marty, talked about how Paul was actually in the desert for 3 years with being discipled by Jesus. And so when he talks about being an apostle as one, unnaturally born, can you give us a little bit of that? I know we'll get back on this topic, but I always found that so interesting, the contrast with Peter and Paul, but then how they became apostles together.
It's a super fascinating study, because Paul's quite adamant in Galatians that when he got called by Jesus, he didn't go hang out with the disciples. He didn't go to the right university. Like, he didn't go to Jerusalem to get trained by them. He says, I went out to Arabia and Damascus, and I got trained by Jesus. And only after that did I go hang out with the apostles to see if what I had been taught by Jesus was correct. And I checked with them, and they said, yes, that's it. And then later he had to go back. Even after he got the thumbs up, he had to go back after 10 years, 14 years later, he has to go back to double check, because everybody's all wound up about it. And they have to give him the right hand of fellowship. So there is this very interesting relationship between Paul being very specifically called by Jesus, but never a part of that havara we spoke about earlier.
Right.
But then going to that same havara, because he still had Paul also wasn't just this rogue guy that was going to do whatever because he had a Jesus experience. He was going to go check that against the guys. He also had this respect for a larger community. He said, if this was truly Jesus, they're going to know. And so he went to them and they said, yep, that's truly Jesus. Makes us nervous, but yep, that's what Jesus taught us. And Paul pushed this group of Jesus followers forward. And in those critical moments, it was the Jesus apostles that were like, nope, this is right. I know it's because this Gentile thing was a big deal, and people didn't want to. Okay, they can come in, but they need to be like us first. Like, they need to eat kosher first. They don't just get to come in here and not eat kosher. They don't get to come in here and not be circumcised.
So they couldn't be themselves.
Right. They got to be like us.
Okay.
And Paul kept absolutely not. And then he kept forcing the issue, and the apostles went, nope. And then they had to have a big, huge meeting in Acts 15 about it. And they all argued. And even though the apostles were not on the same page, by the time they got out of that meeting, they were. And it seemed good to the Holy Spirit that this is the good news for the Gentiles.
The good news. Yeah, I
So-
like that.
Yeah, but when we roll it forward to today, just the practicality of our relationships with other Christians that are different colors and different flavors. So it's really interesting that you mentioned and talked about breaking bread, because kind of for me, one of the, maybe I shouldn't have a litmus test, but I do. And it's, when was the last time you had a black person in your home for dinner? And honestly, for most white Christians, it's never. And so it's kind of like, where do we start? Mike and I have just had a natural friendship for a dozen years and kind of saving each other's lives in the middle of some chaos. But I just see that as a community, we're still missing each other.
Yeah. And And honestly, if I were to speak from my own experience, I don't have a lot of good answers for that. I know I'm trying to get better. I started that journey a handful of years ago, realizing I needed to have more of those relationships. And those have come slowly over time. Because I even struggle with how to build those relationships in the correct way for the correct reasons.
Right.
And I want to have a good respect for that. I know my organization is going through that. I got an email this year, somebody looking at our ministry saying, I'm really excited about what you're doing. I really, really want to support what's going on. But when I look at your website, it's full of a bunch of white people. And that, yeah, I don't know how to fix that and change that, but I want to.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to just be open to how do we change that in the right ways? And honestly, I just have so much that I'm learning in that process.
Well, you're from Idaho, so you probably met both black people that live there.
That did not help me out. Which honestly, there's probably something relatively profound in that, because
I love it.
When I started traveling, that's when I started learning about all this stuff.
Yeah.
And there's something about that. Like, you can talk about the practicality of my travel,
Right.
but there's simply something about getting out of your box into somebody else's that does wonders if you're curious and humble.
Right.
Like, if you're there because you really want to be empathetic and you want to be shaped by the gospel, then getting out of your box into somebody else's is unbelievably transformative.
Yeah.
And that started to change me more than anything else. Simply going to other parts of the country, hearing other people share their stories. I was different and changed. I'm still being changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the key.
Yep.
Listening to one another's stories, just listening to all of us struggling, trying to figure out how to be our best for God. And the mere fact that you say, I'm still learning, I'm still growing. And, I've known you for years, Nick, and I think God blessed us, allowing us to be a part of a church in New York City that was multiracial, multicultural,
Right.
just all types of people. And what I appreciate about my time in New York, hearing other people's stories.
Mm-hmm.
We had super wealthy people. We had people who had just come off a crack, but being together in one room, sharing those stories. So, and that's something that I could get excited about. So,
And you know where those stories get shared the most? Is over a meal.
Over a meal. That's, yeah.
I mean,
so
honestly,
true.
there's something powerful
About
the meal.
meals.
I don't even have to have it all figured out to sit down and say, I'm right with this person. If I sit down and say, I'm as right as I can be and I want to be even more right, well, that's where the magic happens.
That's
it's
what-
over that bread.
We would talk. Go get a slice of pizza. Get a slice and just talk. Get to know each other.
Absolutely.
But this is so helpful, this conversation, because I feel like, and for those of us who've been in the faith a while, we got to set a better example of what it means to have these conversations, because I don't think the younger ones struggle as much with wanting to be together
No way.
as those of us who are a little bit older.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Mike, what would you advise us and podcast listeners that maybe don't have a lot of black relationships naturally? What would you advise people?
Well, I think the key is it's not so much about color as much as pray to find like-minded believers
Right.
who happen to be in all type of colors.
Right.
Just God lead me to people who just want to serve you. And I think we have made this divide bigger in the church than it needs to be,
Right.
because at least in the church we have a common goal. We all want to get to heaven.
Yeah, it's that idea of identity, Marty. You talked a little bit about it. It's when people's first layer of identity is in Christ, then you can have conversations, even uncomfortable conversations, and you can have community because it's based on your first layer of identity. And then the next layers of identity come in, I'm male, I'm white, whatever. But the first layer is, as a Christ follower, then we can have a conversation that starts somewhere other than our differences. Yeah.
Yeah, and to my brown brothers and sisters, we got to get away from cancel culture. If someone doesn't understand us, it's okay. They don't understand. If they're our brother, they want to engage. They're a sister, they want to continue to try to grow. We got to work. We got to work at this.
Yeah.
Because it's easy. And I know I've been guilty of it myself. I'm done, First,
I remember those phone calls.
that's it, Stone Street.
Stone Street. You're going to be my only white friend.
But I'm learning we gotta if somebody genuinely is trying, let's hang in there together.
Amen. Well, Marty, it's so great getting this time with you. Thank
Oh
you for
yeah,
just
thank you so much.
jumping on the Peacemakers podcast. I know you're big on the peacemaker theme and bringing shalom to a broken world.
Absolutely. It's been great to be here. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks.
Really appreciate it. Well, thank you again, everyone, for being a part of today's discussion, and we will have more upcoming episodes. Take care.